So suppose that I offer to make a donation to charity in your name, and I give you a choice between two charities. Charity A provides cancer treatment for people in the developing world who otherwise couldn't afford it. Charity B vaccinates against outbreaks of an infectious disease that breaks out only rarely, but when it does, it has really devastating consequences. Because cancer treatment is a lot more expensive than vaccination, your donation can either provide one person with life-saving cancer treatment, or it can provide, let's say, 4,000 people with vaccinations. Now, there's only a 1 in 1,000 chance that this disease will ever break out in the area where the vaccinations take place, but if it does break out, then half of those 4,000 people who got vaccinated will be saved as a result. So if you donate to Charity A, you save one life for sure. But if you donate to Charity B, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of saving 2,000 lives. Now, if you're like most people, I think you'll feel some pull to give to Charity A, that is, to save the one life for sure. But as you maybe already noticed, there's a sort of simple mathematical argument for giving to Charity B, namely that if you divide the possibility of saving 2,000 lives by the 1 in 1,000 chance of a disease outbreak, then donating to Charity B looks like it has a value equivalent to saving 2 lives for sure, rather than just 1. So the choice between Charity A and Charity B is a philosophical thought experiment, and like many thought experiments, the details are contrived. But in fact, we collectively face a lot of choices that have the same basic structure. Choices between doing some amount of good with high probability and doing a much larger amount of good, but with much smaller probability. Or at least so I'm going to argue in the next few minutes. And what I want to convince you is that when we're faced with these kinds of choices, we have a moral obligation to take the mathematical argument for giving to Charity B seriously. And I want to argue that our tendency to sort of pay not as much attention as the mathematics suggests that we should to high magnitude, low probability considerations in general is dangerous and is also morally problematic. So the real world analogs of Charity B involve what the philosopher Nick Bostrom has called global catastrophic risks. Risks that threaten the existence or threaten the future potential of human civilization. These risks are nearly all recent, either recently emerged or at least they're recently discovered. And their scale requires us to think in a way that we're not used to. Namely, it requires us to recognize that some possibility can be, at the same time, genuinely pretty improbable, and also, nevertheless, very, very important, perhaps among the most important considerations that we face. So take climate change, for example. Even with reasonably serious mitigation efforts, it looks like the sort of likely outcome of climate change at this point is something like 2 to 4 degrees Celsius of warming. That'll be bad and it'll have serious consequences for a lot of people, but it'll at least be something that we can survive and we can adapt to as a civilization. What we hear about less often in debates about climate change is the relatively small but significant chance of a much worse outcome. So the economist Martin Weitzman, for instance, has estimated that even on, again, the assumption of sort of reasonably serious mitigation efforts, there's at least a 5% chance of 10 degrees or more of warming. And there's at least a 1% chance, he estimates, of 20 degrees or more of warming. Just to give some sense of what that entails, the last time global temperatures changed by 5 degrees Celsius, even, was at the end of the last ice age. And the last time that average global temperatures were 5 degrees higher than they are now was 35 million years ago in the Eocene epoch, when the world was so warm that there were alligators living almost at the North Pole. So 10 degrees of warming, twice that, let alone 20, would have absolutely catastrophic consequences that it's not at all clear that we would be able to adapt to. For another example, take nuclear weapons. So this is an issue that's returned to public consciousness a little bit in the last year or two. But even so, I think it's something that we managed to be remarkably complacent about. It's very hard to estimate the probability of nuclear war actually breaking out in any given year or any given time frame, among other reasons because it depends in part on the psychology and the values of particular human beings who are in a position to determine whether nuclear war does or doesn't happen. But since we seem to have had at least a couple of genuinely close calls in just the last 70 years, and since it would only take a couple of bad decisions for nuclear conflict to break out, it seems like we can't be justified in assigning an extremely low probability to those sorts of events. There are also serious debates about what exactly the consequences of a large-scale nuclear exchange would be, but of course it would kill tens of millions of people, and there seems to be at least a serious possibility that it would have direct or indirect consequences that we would be unable to recover from. To give you just one more example of this concept of catastrophic risk, in the last few years there's been increasing public discussion of risks from artificial intelligence. So this is a risk that's still very poorly understood as compared with things like climate change or nuclear weapons, and perhaps it can't be well understood until we're much closer to the actual development of human-level AI. But many experts in the field now take really seriously the possibility that an AI whose values are not aligned with our own might pose a real threat to human civilization sometime in the next century. Now, to simplify a little bit, let's assume that in all three of these cases, climate change, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, the sort of worst case outcome that we're worried about is human extinction. So then we want to ask, how bad would that be? Well, one way of asking how bad human extinction would be is to think about how many human beings, or whatever our successors turn out to be, would come to exist if we don't go extinct in the immediate future. So for instance, if we survive long enough that we become an interplanetary species, that we colonize some significant portion of the galaxy, and then we think of human extinction as equivalent to all of those people dying at once. But that line of argument is controversial for a number of reasons, but in particular because a lot of philosophers don't think that an event that prevents somebody from ever coming to exist in the first place is as bad as an event that kills somebody who already exists. So instead, let's just adopt the much more conservative assumption that what's bad about human extinction is just that it involves the deaths of all the human beings who presently exist. And let's assume that that means roughly 7 billion human beings. So even under that conservative assumption, we should conclude that very small risks of extinction can still matter a lot. So something that carries just a 1% risk of killing 7 billion people is as bad, we say, in expectation, as something that will kill 70 million people for sure. So in other words, it's on the same scale as the greatest tragedies or the greatest catastrophes in human history, just a 1% risk. Now, if we can reduce the risk of human extinction by, say, 1/10 of a percentage point, that's equivalent in expectation to saving 7 million lives. So again, even under very conservative sort of ethical assumptions and conservative assumptions about the probability of extinction and the badness of extinction, we reach the conclusion that mitigating the risk of human extinction should have incredible moral urgency, on a par with the other sort of great moral causes of the last couple of centuries. Now, I've been assuming so far that the right way to think about the importance of a risk, like the risk of human extinction, is to ask how bad would it be if it happened, and then multiply that by the probability that it will happen. But is that the right way to think about risk? So this is controversial in the field called decision theory, where people think about how to make decisions under uncertainty. And actually, my own view is that it's not always the right way to think about risk. But in most ordinary cases, when the probabilities we're talking about are not absurdly large or absurdly small, I think it is the right way to think about risk, and there's a pretty simple reason why. The law of large numbers implies that over the long run, the frequency with which chance events occur will become, again, over the long run, about equal to their sort of intrinsic probability or their chance of happening in any individual case. And what that means is, over the long run, actions that we take that increase the probability of good outcomes or that decrease the probability of bad outcomes will have an average value. If we take many actions that have this effect of changing the probabilities, the average value of those actions will be about equal to their expected value. In other words, the thing that we get when we multiply probabilities by magnitudes. Now, this sort of long-run argument is controversial for a whole bunch of reasons, and in the end, I don't think it provides us with an absolutely general reason to always be guided by this kind of expectational reasoning. But when we're thinking about catastrophic risks like climate change or nuclear weapons or AI, I do think the argument is basically sound, and more particularly, I think we actually face the sort of long run that the argument requires. So the intuitive way to see the point is that small risks can add up, both at a time and also over time. So if there are only one or two sources of catastrophic risk out there in the world, and we were only going to face those risks once or twice over the lifetime of our civilization, then maybe we could just sort of go about our business and hope that we get lucky. But in fact, we face a growing number of distinct sources of catastrophic risk. So we've already talked about climate change, nuclear weapons, AI, but there are also things like drug-resistant or engineered pathogens, nanotechnology, almost certainly other technological risks that we just don't know about yet, not to mention all sorts of natural risks like asteroids. And most people who've thought about this have concluded that even over relatively short time scales, the total risk, when you add all these things together, is substantial. So the Stern Review, for instance, which is a report on the economics of climate change that was commissioned by the UK government, has become one of the most widely cited documents in climate economics, estimates that the probability of human extinction in the next century is about 10%. The philosopher John Leslie has estimated a 30% probability of extinction over the next 5 centuries. And then on the more pessimistic end of the spectrum, the British astronomer Martin Rees has estimated that we have only a 50% probability of surviving until the year 2100. Now, of course, any one of those estimates should be taken with an enormous grain of salt. But the important point is that even on relatively short time scales, the risk of catastrophic outcomes is definitely non-trivial. I think that's safe to say. And maybe more importantly, for at least some sources of catastrophic risk, the risk isn't a one-time thing that we just get over and then we're fine. It's something that can accumulate over time. So for every year, for instance, that states continue to possess large stockpiles of nuclear weapons, there's some risk of a catastrophic nuclear exchange. And if we let things go on long enough, then the chance that it will happen eventually approaches certainty. So Stephen Hawking has made this point. He says, although the chance of a disaster to planet Earth in a given year may be quite low, it adds up over time and it becomes near certainty, he says, in the next 1,000 or 10,000 years. So given that the standard expectational approach to risk tells us that these catastrophic risks are really, really important, and given that the sort of argument for taking that expectational approach seriously seems persuasive in this context, why do these risks not receive more of our attention? Why are they not the subject of Prindle for cable news or on the docket for heated arguments on college campuses? Well, one reason I think is that there are some deeply ingrained features of our psychology that make it hard for us to respond to these risks appropriately. So one of these is called scope neglect. And this is best explained by way of an example. So in one well-known study, people were asked how much they would pay to prevent a certain number of birds from drowning in oil spills. In different versions of the experiment, they were told that the number of birds saved would be 2,000 or 20,000 or 200,000. But the amount that people said they were willing to pay hardly changed at all between the three conditions. So the average amounts that people reported were $80 or $78 or $88 between 2,000, 20,000, and 200,000 birds. Now, the lesson of those experiments isn't that we don't care enough about birds. Rather, it's that we're insufficiently sensitive to the difference between saving 2,000 birds and saving 200,000 birds. And of course, this isn't just true of birds. So suppose you read a story about a person who's in danger, say, from violence or disease or starvation, you'll feel some empathetic response, right? And you'll feel some motivation to do something about it if you can. Now, if you read about 1 million people who are in danger from a genocidal regime or an epidemic or a famine, you're also going to experience an empathetic response. You're also going to experience some motivation, maybe more, maybe less, but what definitely won't happen is you won't experience 1 million times the empathetic response you did in the first case. You won't experience 1 million times the motivation to go and do something about it. Why? Because that's just not something that you're psychologically capable of, right? So in order to respond appropriately to these large-scale problems, we need to engage in and follow through on abstract cost-benefit reasoning, like multiplying magnitudes by probabilities, rather than relying on intuitive or common-sense moral judgments that are just inadequately sensitive to the scale of the problems. Another relevant feature of our psychology is overconfidence. So there's now a lot of research showing that we tend to be more confident of our beliefs in all sorts of domains than we really should be. So for example, if I say that I'm 95% confident that some event is going to happen, well, the events that I'm 95% confident are going to happen should happen about 95% of the time, right, if I'm appropriately confident. But when we actually test this out and look at how accurate people's predictions are when they specify a given confidence level, my 95% confident beliefs are going to turn out to be right maybe 60 or 70% of the time on a good day. Now, events like global nuclear war or runaway climate change or the creation of a hostile artificial intelligence, regardless of how sort of objectively probable or improbable you think they might be, they're certainly hard to predict with confidence. So anybody who's more than 99% confident that one of these things will happen or it won't happen is almost certainly displaying overconfidence. But our natural tendency is to sort of want definite beliefs about the world, want a sort of clear model of the world, rather than a lot of uncertainty and probability. So many of us seem to sort of implicitly think of these things as either just not going to happen, or as so improbable that we don't need to worry about them. And it's worth mentioning that there's a body of research in the psychology of decision-making, particularly in the research program called prospect theory, that finds that when we're faced with low probability events, our tendency is either, on the one hand, to overreact, or, when we're not overreacting, to just round the probabilities down to 0 and ignore them. So finally, third feature of our psychology that seems to be relevant is what's called temporal discounting, which is our tendency to care much more about the immediate future than about the distant future. So this is the reason why we lie around on the couch eating junk food instead of getting out and exercising, even though we all know that exercising will make us happier and better off in the long run. Now, in the environments where we evolved, this focus on the immediate future made sense because we often had to worry about having enough to eat for the next 48 hours. We didn't face the same sort of long-term problems that we face today, and we also didn't have the same ability to make and execute long-term plans for the future. But today we face problems like climate change that are sort of inherently long-term. So there's virtually nothing that we can do to limit the effects of climate change tomorrow or next year, but there's a lot that we can do to mitigate the effects of climate change a century from now. And then there are these emerging challenges like AI that we can sort of see on the horizon. We have some ability to prepare for, we have reason to prepare for, but any planning that we do now is not going to pay off for years or decades at the earliest. So our tendency to discount the future is much less adaptive than it once was. So the bottom line is that the need to reason expectationally about these extremely large-scale risks is a new challenge for us. Even 100 years ago, we didn't have the collective capability to do things that would lead to the destruction of the human race or human civilization on a global scale, or in the case of climate change, we have the capacity, but we didn't know it yet. Because our increasing technological capacity has given rise to this new scale of risk, we now, much more than in the past, need to think in a way that's genuinely sort of uncomfortable, to recognize that some event, some possibility, can be at the same time genuinely pretty improbable and also really, really important. Learning to respond urgently to these things that probably won't happen, and to respond with moral urgency, with a sense of obligation, a sense that we owe it to other people to get these things right, is, I think, one of the great moral challenges of our time. Thank you.